My husband called me from the parking lot of a Michelin-starred restaurant while I was sitting in my best friend's kitchen eating leftover butter chicken straight from the container, and the first thing he said wasn't hello. "I want a divorce," he said. "I've already talked to a lawyer." I remember the exact sound of the spoon hitting the bottom of the pot. My friend looked up from across the counter. I held up one finger, and walked into her hallway, closing the door quietly behind me. "Say that again," I said. "You heard me. This isn't working, Nora. It hasn't been working for a long time. You know that." Nora, not sweetheart, not even my full name, just Nora, flat and final, like he was reading it off a form. I stood there in the hallway with its familiar smell of old hardwood and her kids' rain boots lined up by the door, and I thought, he has no idea. He genuinely has no idea who he just called. 2 years earlier, I had sat at our kitchen table in Oakville and watched my husband get dressed for work, the kind of slow, deliberate ritual that announces a man who believes his morning matters, and I had realized something very quietly. The company I had built from nothing, the one I'd been running in the margins of my life for 6 years, was worth more than anything he had ever touched, and he didn't know it existed. That's the part people never quite believe. Not the success. People can accept success. It's the silence around it that throws them. How do you build something that size without your spouse knowing? The honest answer is, when someone stops paying attention to you, they stop seeing you entirely. My husband had stopped seeing me somewhere around year 4 of our marriage. I became the person who managed the house, coordinated the kids' schedules, remembered which dry cleaner had his Goodwill coat. I became useful infrastructure. He talked about his work constantly, the firm, his clients, the deals he was navigating, and he asked about mine the way you ask someone if they've seen your keys. Perfunctory, not really listening for the answer. So when my small consulting practice quietly became something else, when the contracts started coming from companies whose names I recognized from the business section of the Globe and Mail, when I incorporated under a holding company and began structuring things properly, he noticed none of it. I had a dedicated line on my phone, a separate email, an office downtown that my assistant managed full-time. My husband thought I did freelance project management. He said it at dinner parties with a vague wave of his hand, the way you describe something that doesn't quite warrant explanation. I didn't correct him. I told myself it was because the time never felt right. But I think the deeper truth was that I wanted to know how long he would go without being curious. About me. About anything I did. The answer turned out to be indefinitely. By the time he called me in that hallway, Meridian Advisory had 17 full-time staff, a client list that included 3 of the top 10 commercial real estate developers in Ontario, and a contract pending with a federal infrastructure fund that would be the largest single engagement in the firm's history. I had been quietly, methodically building it during school pickups and conference calls and Saturday afternoons when he was golfing and thought I was doing admin. I told my husband I needed a few days to process what he'd said. He seemed surprised I didn't argue. I think he expected tears or panic or at minimum a conversation about what went wrong. Instead I said calmly, "Okay, let's talk properly when I'm home." He said that was reasonable. He used the word reasonable like he was complimenting my behavior. I sat back down in my friend's kitchen and I told her everything. Not about the divorce, about the company, about what was actually happening. She already knew pieces of it, but not the full picture. When I finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then she said, "Does he know who your new federal contract is with?" "No," I said. She looked at me. "Nora. His firm is one of the consortiums bidding on that project." I already knew. I had known for 3 weeks. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something quieter and stranger. The feeling of watching 2 separate timelines in your life suddenly converge and knowing that what happens next is completely in your hands. My husband's firm, Callaway Partners, was a mid-sized infrastructure consultancy based in Toronto. They were good, genuinely good at what they did, but they'd been struggling over the past 18 months. I knew this not because my husband told me, but because I'd read the same trade publications he left on our coffee table, and I understood what certain patterns meant. A lateral hire that doesn't quite fit. A key client relationship that quietly goes to tender. The kind of controlled professional erosion that looks fine from the outside until it suddenly doesn't. The federal contract they were chasing, a transit corridor assessment across 3 provinces, was exactly the kind of work that could stabilize them for the next 4 years. My husband had mentioned it at dinner twice, both times with a careful casualness that meant he was more anxious about it than he was letting on. Meridian was also bidding. We had been shortlisted 2 weeks before he called me in that hallway. I went home 2 days later. We had the conversation he'd been preparing for. Calm, measured, the kind of discussion that happens when both people know it's over and are just negotiating the terms of the ending. He was not unkind. That's the thing I want to be clear about. My husband was not a cruel man. He was an incurious one. He had decided at some point that he understood me completely and then stopped looking. That kind of casual dismissal can hollow out a marriage just as surely as anything dramatic. We agreed to separate. He moved into the guest room. We told the kids we were working through some things, which was technically true. Our daughter, she's 16 and sees everything, looked at me that first night and said quietly, "Are you okay, Mom?" I said yes. She studied my face for a moment and then she said, "You seem okay." I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to feel the weight of it all. The years, the effort, the strange loneliness of being invisible to the person who was supposed to see you most clearly. Then I got up, opened my laptop, and reviewed the final submission package for the federal tender. The assessment process took 8 weeks. 3 firms remained on the shortlist, a large national consultancy out of Vancouver, Callaway Partners, and Meridian Advisory. My husband knew I had submitted something through the firm, in a vague way. He'd heard the word federal contract mentioned. He didn't ask specifics. He was dealing with his own submission, and I think he'd long ago filed Meridian under Nora's freelance thing, too small to be a real competitor in anything he considered serious. The notification came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was dropping our son off at his hockey practice in Mississauga, sitting in the parking lot with the heat running, when my phone lit up with an email from the procurement office. I read it twice. Then I sat there for another minute, listening to the slap of pucks against boards from inside the arena, and I thought about the 6 years of 5 a.m. mornings and late-night calls and the particular discipline of building something in the silence of your own life. Meridian had been awarded the contract. The formal announcement came 3 days later in an industry circular that went out to all the bidding firms and their stakeholders. I know the exact moment my husband read it because he came into the kitchen with his laptop open and his face arranged in a specific way, the face of someone who has encountered information they cannot immediately reconcile. "Meridian Advisory," he said, holding out the screen. "That's your firm." "Yes," I said. He looked at the contract value on the screen. He looked at me. He looked back at the screen. "This is," he stopped. "This is a $38 million engagement. Over 4 years, yes. You've been running a firm worth." "I've been running it for 6 years," I said. "You were aware I had a consulting practice." "I thought you did." He stopped again. He set the laptop down on the counter. "I thought you did project coordination, small contracts, administrative support." "I know," I said. That was the moment. Not dramatic. No raised voices. Just that sentence. "I know," and everything it contained. "I know you thought that. I know you never asked. I know exactly how little you thought of what I was doing, and I know what it cost me to keep going anyway." He sat down at the kitchen table. I'd never seen him look quite like that before. Not angry, not defensive, just genuinely recalibrating. He's a smart man. He understood immediately what it meant that Meridian had won the contract his firm had been counting on. He understood what it meant that his wife had built something he'd never bothered to understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "When would I have?" I said, not unkindly. "When were you curious?" He didn't have an answer for that. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way that endings always are. We had lawyers and meetings and the exhausting administrative work of separating a life built over 14 years. He was fair. I'll say that too. Whatever had eroded between us personally, he didn't let it become adversarial. I think the contract announcement had shifted something in the way he saw the whole situation. He stopped framing the divorce as something that was happening to him and started treating it as something we were both navigating. Our daughter started asking me questions about the firm. Not intrusive, she's careful that way, but real questions. How did you structure the holding company? How do you handle procurement compliance on federal contracts? She's in grade 11, and she'd been quietly reading about corporate governance in her spare time, which I only found out when she sent me an article about beneficial ownership disclosure with the message, "Have you seen this? She's going to be extraordinary." My son is 12 and his primary concern remains hockey, which I find deeply grounding. The industry response to the contract announcement was significant. Meridian had been operating with a degree of deliberate obscurity. I'd made choices over the years to keep a low profile, take on work through referrals, avoid the conference circuit. The federal award changed that. We started receiving inbound inquiries almost immediately. 2 provincial governments, a major pension fund infrastructure team, a private equity group that had been watching the transit sector for years. My name started appearing in places it hadn't before, a profile in Canadian business, a panel invitation from the Sholich School of Business. My assistant, who has been with me since year 2 and who handles everything with a particular brand of competent exasperation, forwarded me the requests with one-line summaries and the occasional editorial comment. "This one's legitimate," she'd write. Or, "This is PR, skip it. She's rarely wrong." I accepted the Sholich panel. The topic was women in infrastructure consulting, a sector that has been, for most of its existence, structured around the assumption that practitioners are men who golf and network at a certain kind of dinner. I've sat in rooms where I was the only woman, the youngest person and the most qualified person simultaneously, and watched men address their questions to the colleague next to me. I know that world from the inside. The panel was held on a Thursday afternoon in February. My husband, my ex-husband now, technically, though the paperwork was still working its way through the system, was at a conference in Calgary that week. I know because our son had a tournament the same weekend and we'd coordinated on logistics. There were 4 panelists. I was introduced last, and when the moderator read my biography, the firm's founding, the contract win, the client list, I watched the faces in the audience shift into that particular expression that means people are recalculating. It's a look I've come to recognize. It involves a small involuntary adjustment around the eyes. A woman in the second row caught my attention. She had a notebook open and she was writing quickly. After the panel, she found me near the coffee station and introduced herself. She was finishing her MBA and working part-time at a boutique consulting firm in Waterloo. She said she'd been trying to figure out how to structure a practice that could be taken seriously without the backing of a large firm behind it. We talked for 20 minutes. I gave her my assistant's card and told her to reach out if she had specific questions. She said, "And I remember this, I didn't know this was possible. Building it the way you did." I said, "Most things are possible. They just require a longer timeline than people expect." My ex-husband called me that evening, ostensibly about our son's tournament schedule. Somewhere near the end of the conversation, he said, "I heard the panel went well." "It did," I said. There was a pause. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said, about when would you have told me? When were you curious?" I remember. "I wasn't," he said, "curious enough. I want you to know I understand that now." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was honest. And coming from him, honesty was the harder thing. I said, "I appreciate that." We talked for another few minutes about the tournament. He said he'd pick our son up on Sunday. I said that worked. We hung up. I sat for a while afterward in my home office, the same room where I'd run conference calls during nap time years ago, where I'd learned to model infrastructure cash flows on a used Lenovo laptop because I couldn't justify buying a new one. And I looked at the framed photo on my desk. My kids, last summer at a friend's cottage on Georgian Bay. My daughter has her arms around her brother, and she's squinting into the sun, and there's something in her expression that I see sometimes in my own reflection, a kind of quiet assessment, like she's already working something out. Meridian's next project was a watershed. We were engaged by a provincial housing authority to assess development feasibility across 11 sites in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the largest scope of work the firm had taken on. My senior team had to scale fast. We hired 8 people in 4 months, including 2 who came to us directly from firms that had spent years not quite seeing them clearly. I know something about that particular experience. The woman from the Schulich panel emailed 3 months later. She'd restructured her practice, landed a retainer with a mid-sized developer, and had a question about sub-consultant agreements. My assistant forwarded it to me with a note. She did the thing. I wrote back directly. My daughter submitted her university applications in November, commerce at Queen's, economics at McGill, and her wild card, she called it. A joint program at Waterloo in mathematics and business. She didn't ask me to review her essays, but she did ask me one question while she was writing them. "Mom," she said, "when you started the firm, did you know it was going to work?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. The early years. The uncertainty. The particular discipline of continuing when nothing external confirmed you were on the right track, when the only evidence you had was your own judgment. "No," I said, "but I trusted the work more than I trusted the doubt." She nodded, like I'd confirmed something she'd already decided. She submitted her applications the next morning. What I've come to understand on the other side of all of it is that the hardest part wasn't building the firm. The hard part was the years of watching someone who was supposed to know me decide they already knew everything there was to know, and choosing to keep building anyway. Not out of spite. Or not only that, but because the work was real and it was mine, and it didn't require his recognition to be worth doing. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in April. My lawyer texted me when the certificate was filed. I was on a call with a client in Edmonton at the time, and I nodded to myself and kept talking. That evening my daughter made pasta, the complicated kind, with a real ragu that takes 3 hours, and the 3 of us ate at the kitchen table, and she told us about a project she'd been doing for her economics class, an analysis of housing affordability across mid-sized Canadian cities. And she had opinions about the methodology, and she wasn't shy about them. My son argued with her cheerfully about something tangential, and she demolished his argument with the patient precision of someone who has been watching how to do exactly that for her entire life. I sat there listening to them, and I thought about that hallway 6 years ago, the locked door, the first contract, the choice to keep going quietly in the margins of a life that hadn't made much room for me. It made plenty of room now. The world doesn't always see the work that happens in the in-between moments, the thinking done in parking lots and on the phone at school pickups and at the kitchen table after everyone else has gone to sleep. Women build things in the margins all the time. We always have. The difference is in who's paying attention. I intend to keep going. There's always another project, another problem worth solving, another young woman at a coffee station who needs to see that it's possible. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. My daughter got into all 3 programs. She chose Waterloo. There's a version of this story I used to tell myself in the hard years. A tidier version, where I had a plan from the beginning and everything unfolded the way I intended. That version isn't true. The truth is messier and I think more worth saying out loud. I didn't build Meridian because I knew my marriage would end. I built it because the work was real and I needed something in my life that couldn't be taken away by someone else's indifference. That's not a heroic origin story. It's just what happens when you decide to keep going even when no one is watching. What I understand now, sitting on the other side of all of it, is that the outcomes in my life, the contract, the divorce, the conversation in that kitchen, weren't accidents. They followed from choices I made, quietly and consistently, over years. Not big dramatic choices, small ones. The choice to take the course instead of watching television. The choice to return the call at 6 a.m. instead of sleeping in. The choice to keep the work separate and serious even when my husband's vague hand wave suggested it wasn't. Every one of those choices compounded into something I couldn't have predicted from any single point along the way. I think about my daughter a lot when I try to make sense of this. She asked me, while writing her university applications, whether I'd known the firm would work. I told her I trusted the work more than I trusted the doubt. What I didn't say, because she'll figure it out herself, is that trusting the work is a moral act as much as a practical one. It means taking your own capabilities seriously enough to protect them. It means refusing to let someone else's ceiling become your floor. That's not arrogance. That's just honesty about what you owe yourself and the people watching you. My husband was not a bad man. I want to be careful about that because the easy version of this story needs a villain and he doesn't quite fit the role. He was incurious. He made assumptions and then stopped updating them. And the consequence of that, the real, measurable consequence, was that he walked into a contract evaluation not knowing that his competition was the person sitting across from him at the breakfast table. That's not fate punishing him. That's just what happens when you stop paying attention. The world keeps moving whether you're watching or not. What I hope my daughter takes from all of it, from watching me navigate the firm and the marriage and the years between, is not that she should hide her strength or bide her time or wait for the perfect moment to reveal herself. I hope she takes this, that the discipline of doing good work, honestly and consistently without requiring external validation to keep going, is its own kind of power, not a weapon, not a performance, just the quiet accumulating force of a person who knows what they're doing and keeps doing it anyway. She got into Waterloo. She chose the harder program. I wasn't surprised. The world doesn't run short of people who will underestimate you. It runs short of people willing to outlast them.